I discovered my therapist was my ex-wife's brother, feeding her information about my mental state for our custody battle. The custody hearing was coming up in 3 weeks, and I felt more confident than I had in months thanks to the progress I'd been making in sessions. My therapist had been helping me work through my anger issues and anxiety, giving me tools to handle the stress of potentially losing access to my kids. What I didn't know was that every breakthrough, every vulnerability, every moment of weakness I shared was being systematically reported back to my ex-wife's legal team. The discovery happened completely by accident on a Tuesday afternoon, when I was picking up my prescription at the pharmacy near my therapist's office. I was standing in line behind an older woman who was having trouble with her insurance, so I had time to glance around at the various health pamphlets and notices on the bulletin board. That's when I saw a small business card tucked between flyers for flu shots and diabetes screenings. The card had my therapist's name on it, but underneath was a different last name than what I knew him by, and it mentioned Family Mediation Services. My stomach dropped as I read the card more carefully. The last name was the same as my ex-wife's maiden name, the one she'd gone back to using after our divorce. I stood there holding that little piece of cardboard, feeling like the ground was shifting under my feet. The woman in front of me was still arguing with the pharmacist about her copay, but I couldn't hear anything except the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I left the pharmacy without getting my prescription and drove straight home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Once I got to my apartment, I immediately started digging through every document I had related to the divorce proceedings. I found my ex-wife's contact information and saw her brother's name listed as an emergency contact. The first name matched my therapist's first name, but the last name was different from what he'd told me. The realization hit me like a freight train. This man I'd been pouring my heart out to for 6 months, telling him about my struggles with depression after the divorce, my fears about being a good father, my financial stress from the alimony payments, all of it had been going straight back to my ex-wife. I thought about all the times I'd broken down in his office, admitting to moments of rage where I'd punched walls or thrown things, talking about how overwhelmed I felt trying to balance work and parenting time. I spent the next 2 hours pacing around my living room, trying to piece together the timeline. My ex-wife had recommended this therapist to me, saying she'd heard good things about him from a friend. She'd even offered to help pay for the sessions, which I'd thought was generous given how bitter our divorce had been. Now I realized it was an investment in building a case against me for the custody hearing. My phone rang around 8 that evening, and I saw my ex-wife's number on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She started talking about how she'd been thinking about our upcoming court date and wondered if we could work out some kind of compromise. She mentioned specific things I'd never told her, details about my mental state that I'd only shared with my therapist. She talked about how she understood I was struggling with anger management and suggested that maybe supervised visitation would be better for everyone involved. She brought up my financial stress and how it might be affecting my ability to provide a stable environment for the kids. Every word she spoke felt like a knife twisting in my chest because I knew exactly where she was getting this information. After I hung up, I sat on my couch staring at the wall for what felt like hours. The betrayal was so deep and so calculated that I couldn't even process it fully. This wasn't just about the custody battle anymore. It was about the systematic destruction of my trust in the one person who was supposed to be helping me heal from the trauma of my divorce. I called in sick to work the next day and spent the morning researching ethics violations for mental health professionals. I found the state licensing board's website and started reading through the complaint process. The violations were clear: conflict of interest, breach of confidentiality, and failure to disclose a relationship that could affect treatment. I had grounds for a formal complaint that could potentially end his career. But filing a complaint wouldn't help me with the custody hearing that was rapidly approaching. I needed to figure out how to handle this situation without completely destroying my chances of maintaining a relationship with my kids. I couldn't just walk into court and claim my therapist had been spying on me without solid proof, and I couldn't afford to lose the few character witnesses I had left. That afternoon, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of confronting my therapist directly or immediately filing complaints, I decided to turn the situation to my advantage. If he was going to feed information to my ex-wife, I would make sure that information painted me in the best possible light for the custody hearing. I started planning what I would say in my next session, crafting a narrative that would make me look like the ideal father while still seeming authentic and natural. I would talk about my commitment to my children's well-being, my financial stability improving, and my anger management techniques working effectively. I would mention specific parenting strategies I'd been implementing and how much I'd grown as a person since the divorce. The next session was surreal. I sat across from this man who had been pretending to care about my mental health while secretly gathering ammunition for my ex-wife's legal team. I talked about how much progress I felt I'd made in controlling my emotions and how excited I was about the upcoming custody hearing because I felt ready to be the father my kids deserved. I mentioned that I'd been saving money for a larger apartment so the kids could have their own rooms when they stayed with me. I talked about the parenting classes I'd been taking and how they'd helped me understand better ways to communicate with children going through divorce. I even brought up how I'd been volunteering at a local community center, helping other divorced fathers navigate their own custody situations. The therapist seemed pleased with my progress, nodding and taking notes just like he always did. But now I knew those notes weren't for my benefit. They were intelligence reports being passed along to the enemy. The knowledge gave me a strange sense of power, like I was finally playing the game instead of being played by it. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued this charade during my sessions. I talked about meditation practices I'd adopted, books I'd been reading about healthy co-parenting relationships, and how I'd been working on forgiveness and letting go of resentment toward my ex-wife. I painted myself as a model of emotional growth and stability, someone who had learned from his mistakes and was ready to be a responsible, involved father. Meanwhile, I was secretly gathering evidence of the therapist's ethical violations. I recorded our sessions on my phone, being careful to follow the state's recording laws. I documented every instance where he asked leading questions about topics that would be relevant to custody proceedings. I also started paying closer attention to the timing of my ex-wife's phone calls and how they correlated with information I'd shared in therapy. The pattern became unmistakable. Within 24 hours of every session, my ex-wife would bring up something related to what I'd discussed with the therapist. If I talked about work stress, she'd call asking about my job security. If I mentioned feeling overwhelmed with parenting responsibilities, she'd suggest reducing my visitation time. The correlation was too consistent to be coincidental. 3 days before the custody hearing, I made my final move. I scheduled an emergency session with the therapist, claiming I was having a panic attack about the upcoming court date. During that session, I laid out my entire strategy for the hearing, including specific points my lawyer planned to make and evidence we intended to present. I talked about character witnesses who would testify on my behalf and mentioned that I'd been keeping a detailed journal of all my interactions with the children. Most importantly, I expressed complete confidence that the judge would see through my ex-wife's attempts to manipulate the system. I said I believed truth and justice would prevail, and that I was looking forward to having my parental rights fully restored. I wanted to plant the seed that I was more prepared for this hearing than my ex-wife realized. The therapist seemed unusually interested in the details of my legal strategy, asking follow-up questions about my lawyer's approach and what evidence I planned to present. His questions were so specific and legally focused that it became obvious he wasn't asking as a mental health professional, but as someone gathering intelligence for the opposing side. That evening, my ex-wife called me in a panic. She started backtracking on her previous demands, suddenly willing to negotiate a more favorable custody arrangement. She mentioned being worried about how the hearing might go and suggested that maybe we could work something out privately. For the first time in months, I heard genuine fear in her voice instead of the calculated confidence she'd been displaying. I played along, acting surprised by her sudden change of heart. I asked her what had brought about this shift in perspective, and she gave vague answers about wanting to do what was best for the kids. But I could tell she was fishing for information about what I might have told my lawyer or what evidence I might have gathered. The night before the custody hearing, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how this whole situation had started with me genuinely trying to get help for my mental health struggles after the divorce. I'd been vulnerable and honest with someone I trusted, only to have that trust weaponized against me in the most personal way possible. But I also felt a strange sense of pride in how I'd handled the discovery. Instead of letting anger and betrayal consume me, I'd found a way to turn the situation to my advantage. I'd played the long game, using their own tactics against them while maintaining the moral high ground. The custody hearing itself was almost anticlimactic. My ex-wife's lawyer seemed unprepared and kept making arguments that contradicted the picture of me as an unstable, unfit father. They had clearly been expecting me to present as angry, defensive, and emotionally unstable, based on the information they'd been receiving from the therapist. Instead, I appeared calm, collected, and well-prepared. My lawyer presented evidence of my financial stability, my commitment to parenting education, and my efforts to create a positive co-parenting relationship. Character witnesses testified about my involvement in my children's lives and my emotional growth since the divorce. The judge was particularly impressed by my journal entries, documenting positive interactions with my children and my efforts to shield them from the conflict between their parents. I had been keeping this journal all along, but I'd never mentioned it to the therapist because I wanted to keep some aspects of my life private. When it came time for my ex-wife's side to present their case, they seemed to be arguing against a different person entirely. They talked about anger management issues that I'd clearly overcome, financial instability that no longer existed, and emotional volatility that wasn't evident in my courtroom presentation. The judge awarded me joint custody with equal parenting time, which was everything I'd been hoping for. But more than that, I felt like I'd reclaimed my dignity and my sense of agency in a situation where I'd been completely manipulated. After the hearing, I finally confronted my ex-wife about the therapist. I told her I knew about the relationship and that I had evidence of the ethical violations. I explained that while I could pursue formal complaints and potentially criminal charges, I was willing to let it go if she agreed to honor the custody arrangement without further legal challenges. She broke down crying, admitting that the whole thing had been her brother's idea. She said she'd been desperate to protect the kids from what she saw as my instability after the divorce, and he'd convinced her that gathering information through therapy sessions was the best way to build a case for sole custody. I felt a mix of anger and pity watching her cry. The anger was for the betrayal and the systematic violation of my privacy and trust. The pity was for someone who had been so afraid of losing control that she'd been willing to destroy any possibility of a healthy co-parenting relationship. In the end, I decided not to file formal complaints against the therapist. I felt like I'd already won the only victory that mattered, keeping my relationship with my children intact. Pursuing revenge would have required reliving the whole experience through investigations and hearings, and I was ready to move forward with my life. Instead, I found a new therapist, one I researched thoroughly to ensure there were no conflicts of interest. I was honest with her about what had happened and how it had affected my ability to trust mental health professionals. She helped me work through the complex emotions around the betrayal, while also continuing to address the underlying issues that had led me to seek therapy in the first place. The experience taught me that sometimes the people who claim to want to help you are the ones who can hurt you the most. But it also showed me that I was stronger and more resilient than I'd given myself credit for. I'd faced a situation that could have destroyed me and found a way to not just survive but to thrive. My relationship with my ex-wife gradually improved over the following months. We developed a functional co-parenting relationship based on clear boundaries and mutual respect for the custody arrangement. She never apologized directly for what happened with the therapist, but she also never challenged the custody agreement or tried to manipulate the system again. The kids adjusted well to the new arrangement. They seemed happier having regular, predictable time with both parents, and they were no longer caught in the middle of constant legal battles. I made sure never to badmouth their mother in front of them, even though I had every right to be angry about what she'd done. Looking back, I realized that discovering the therapist's betrayal was actually a turning point in my post-divorce recovery. It forced me to take control of my own narrative and stop being a victim of circumstances. I learned to trust my instincts, to verify information before accepting it, and to protect myself while still remaining open to genuine help and support. The whole experience also made me a better father. I became more aware of the importance of honest communication, clear boundaries, and protecting my children from adult conflicts. I realized that being a good parent meant being strong enough to do the right thing even when others around you were acting badly. Today, I have a healthy relationship with my kids, a stable co-parenting arrangement with my ex-wife, and a genuine therapeutic relationship with a professional I trust. The betrayal I experienced could have made me bitter and paranoid, but instead it made me more discerning and self-reliant. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never seen that business card in the pharmacy. Would I have lost custody of my kids based on manipulated information? Would I have continued pouring my heart out to someone who was systematically betraying my trust? The thought still makes me angry, but mostly I feel grateful that I discovered the truth when I did. The experience taught me that recovery from difficult life events isn't just about healing from the original trauma. Sometimes you have to recover from the people who were supposed to help you heal. But if you can navigate that additional layer of betrayal, you come out stronger and more authentic than you were before. I never saw that therapist again after the custody hearing. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he moved his practice to another state, possibly to avoid the fallout from his ethical violations. I don't know if my ex-wife ever told him that I'd discovered the truth, but I suspect she did because he never attempted to contact me or schedule follow-up appointments. The whole ordeal lasted almost 8 months from start to finish, but it changed my perspective on trust, vulnerability, and personal boundaries in ways that continue to influence my life today. I'm more careful about who I open up to, but I'm also more confident in my ability to handle whatever life throws at me. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and protecting what matters most to you. My children have a loving, stable relationship with both their parents, and that's worth more than any satisfaction I might have gotten from destroying the career of someone who betrayed my trust. The custody arrangement has been in place for over 2 years now, and it's working better than I ever imagined it would. My ex-wife and I have learned to communicate effectively about our children's needs, and we've even managed to attend some of their school events together without any drama or conflict. I still think about that moment in the pharmacy sometimes, when I saw that business card and felt my world shift beneath my feet. It was one of those pivotal moments that could have gone in so many different directions, but I'm proud of how I handled it. I turned a situation where I was being victimized into an opportunity to take control of my own story. The therapist's betrayal could have broken me, but instead it made me stronger. It taught me to trust my instincts, to verify important information, and to never give anyone else complete control over my narrative. These are lessons that have served me well in all areas of my life, from parenting to work to personal relationships. I hope that sharing this story might help someone else who finds themselves in a similar situation. Betrayal by someone you trust is one of the most devastating experiences a person can go through, but it doesn't have to define you or destroy your future. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up teaching us the most important lessons about our own strength and resilience. The most important thing I learned is that you can't control what other people do to you, but you can control how you respond to it. I chose to respond with strategy rather than emotion, with forgiveness rather than revenge, and with hope rather than bitterness. Those choices made all the difference in the outcome. Today, my kids are happy, healthy, and secure in the knowledge that both their parents love them unconditionally. That's the only victory that really matters, and it's one that no amount of betrayal or manipulation could ever take away from me.